Welcome to episode 16 of the Liberty Itch podcast. In this episode, I speak to James Roguski about the World Health Organization's controversial pandemic agreement. In case you did not know, the Australian government recently adopted it. Yep, no vote, no discussion, just Senator Penny Wong's quiet press release on her website that Australia is proud to be all in on the pandemic agreement. Fortunately, Ms. Wong is, and you'll be shocked to hear this, not telling the truth. The supposedly adopted agreement is not actually signed because it cannot be signed. It's not finished. It's missing the small section about, all the things everybody's agreeing to do and how to do them. As James will explain, the fact, though, that the agreement cannot be signed does not mean Australia is out of the woods on this, not even nearly. The WHO quietly took some of the worrying parts of the original pandemic treaty and literally hid them in the latest version of the international health regulations as though they had always been there. The terms were moved, not removed. As a member state of the WHO, Australia had almost a year until tomorrow, July 19th, 2025, to decline accepting the revised IHR. But they didn't and obviously won't. The rest of the incomplete revised pandemic agreement is still absolutely horrifying. I've read it and you can too using the link in the show notes. To summarise, signatory nations will build a permanent, massive, nationwide biological dragnet apparatus to constantly search and surveil every citizen, creature, chemical and object that could possibly be or become harmful to health. Then, upon discovery of any real or imagined threat, the maximum hysterical response will be invoked. Border closures, quarantines, lockdowns, curfews, basically a never-ending replay of the draconian COVID response on steroids. You see, the WHO admits that the COVID response was a disaster, but just not for the reasons you and I recognise. According to the WHO, the problem with COVID was that they did not have the power to enforce harsher lockdowns faster and get more vaccines forced upon more people more quickly. This is the problem the pandemic agreement exists to solve. So the main thrust of the agreement and the focus and priority of the permanent biological threat dragnet is the patenting, licensing, financing, production and logistics of vaccines. Endless vaccines. Vaccines for everything, always, forever. And of course, to round out the dystopian nightmare, there is the global digital ID, misinformation management, otherwise known as censorship, etc., required to ensure maximum success of the massive new global vaccine industrial complex. All of the crazy conspiracies are in there. They're just masked by the mind-numbing dullness of 30 pages of bureaucratic policy legalese. Exactly like the climate agreements, the pandemic agreement is about building this multi-trillion-dollar, multinational, self-sustaining fascistic machine dedicating to plundering state coffers. And just like the climate con, the WHO promises to save the world from a fictional threat created by the same people claiming to solve the problem. And if you have any doubt as to the sinister intent and determination of the WHO, you must consider this timeline. From its inception in 1948 through to 2005, the WHO was only significantly concerned with 3 diseases: cholera, yellow fever, and plague. Then in 2005, it introduced PHEICS, Pandemic Health Emergencies of International Concern. The definition of a fake pandemic was one that would cause, quote, enormous numbers of deaths and illness, end quote. So the first fake was swine flu in 2009. But that fake fizzled as Dr. Neil Ferguson's prediction of 65,000 deaths in the UK fell slightly short by 64,543, or in other words, 99.7% wrong. For reference, Dr. Neil Ferguson was the same genius whose monstrously exaggerated COVID death estimates were the basis of the worldwide lockdown recommendation. He is also the one who caused the unnecessary slaughter of millions of cattle because he overestimated deaths from mad cow disease by 30,000%. He also predicted 200 million human deaths from bird flu. and was wrong by 199,999,545, or 99.999% wrong. Another 6 million cattle were unnecessarily slaughtered from his similarly wildly wrong foot and mouth disease predictions. I could go on. A rational person would look at this track record of consistent radical failure and conclude two basic things. First, stop listening to Dr. Neil Ferguson. And second, the lack of people dying is actually a good thing. But the WHO did not see things this way. They've kept on relying on Dr. Neil Ferguson. And to solve the problem of insufficient death from pandemics, they changed the definition of pandemic. They removed the need for a fake to cause death or even illness altogether. A pandemic simply has to affect lots of people. The new definition even allows for old viruses to which we already have immunity to be classified as a pandemic emergency, thereby invoking the irrational hysterical response we saw with COVID. With this new definition in place, having only declared one pandemic emergency in the previous 61 years, the WHO then declared fakes in 2013, 14, 15, 18, 19, and even in 2022. Yes, in 2022, that lukewarm monkeypox murmur was actually a declared pandemic health emergency of international concern. But perhaps you think I'm being overly cynical and you still view the WHO as a group of selfless saints who care deeply about people's health. Well, then you must consider that the WHO definition of health is not the definition used in the dictionary or by government health departments. For centuries, health has been defined as the absence of disease. If there is nothing wrong with you, then you are healthy. That definition is far too limiting for the aspirations of the WHO, however. So they redefined health as, quote, a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, end quote. This definition is both meaningless and yet simultaneously all-inclusive. Health apparently now includes mental and social well-being. What is that? The WHO does not say, and they refuse to define well-being even though it is central to their definition of health. It means whatever they want it to mean, and this is the context upon which you must consider the pandemic agreement. It has nothing to do with actual health. It is transparently focused on forming a multi-trillion-dollar global pharmaceutical boondoggle paid for by your tax dollars and used against you by your government. It will employ tens, hundreds of thousands of people in a constant search for problems that simply do not exist, to justify constant unnecessary medical interventions. It is a 21st century version of government digging holes in order to fill the holes back up. Except in this case, you are the hole that is going to be endlessly filled with vaccines. Of course, the WHO argues that each nation's compliance is voluntary. But this voluntary aspect is not about respect of national sovereignty. It is actually about mutual cancellation of culpability, as we already saw during COVID. The WHO will recommend draconian human rights abuses, but then claim they are purely voluntary. The government will invoke those draconian human rights abuses, but they will claim to be innocently following the WHO recommendations for people's health and safety. So just like COVID, the WHO and government will use each other to deflect responsibility for the criminality they impose. And the hundreds of thousands of people permanently employed by the new fake machine will defend its legitimacy in the same way people profiting off the climate change con do. So I implore you to look over the pandemic agreement for yourself. The link is in the notes below. Yes, it is mind-numbingly dull, but this is monumentally serious. Penny Wong has already announced Australia is 100% on board with this nightmare. As utterly insane as it is coming. So with that introduction out of the way, let's pick up the conversation with Mr. James Roguski about the details.
Teleport yourself back in time to about the middle of 2021. Okay. There was this fear, a lot of things happened in 2020. They didn't happen everywhere on the planet in the same way. What happened in Australia or New Zealand lagged a little bit in time, with other countries. But if you go to around the middle of 2021, where certainly in the United States and other countries, the jab had rolled out pretty strong. But a lot of countries were not able to obtain the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and so forth. There was a disparity in who was getting jabbed. Originally, the idea was, all of the elderly people or frontline workers like doctors and nurses and emergency personnel, they were supposed to, like around the world, get priority. But that isn't what happened. There were problems with, production. There were problems with cold chain storage and distribution and logistics and all that. And there were problems in money, because it's one thing when the U.S. government is just printing money and throwing trillions of dollars at the pharmaceutical companies, where other poorer nations didn't have the capacity to do that. And they didn't want to give up in contracts, their embassies or their military bases or whatever Pfizer was asking certain countries to promise, as liability protection. So at that time, if you can allow yourself to believe that these products were life-saving the way they were promoted, and not everybody could get them, there rose an argument that was vaccine apartheid, that the wealthy, predominantly white nations were hogging up all this wonderful stuff, and the predominantly black and brown poorer nations were unable to get this life-saving wonder drug. There came this call for negotiations through the WHO to fix that problem of inequitable distribution of these types of products. Well,
sorry, was
with
that
the benefit of, pardon?
Who called for that?
There were many voices, but one of the primary ones was a group called the Independent Panel. The WHO put together a group of people. One of them, Helen Clark from New Zealand. She was prior to Ardern, and many other people put together a report that essentially called for, this is one of the first articles I wrote about this, was back in March. I think I published a video March 19th of 2022. But they had published this, almost a year prior. And what happened in December of 2021 was there was a special session of the WHO, and the nations who were, they felt, being shortchanged and not getting access to ventilators and remdesivir and the jabs and all that, called a special session, and they voted to start these negotiations. And so what they called for was a framework convention. It's a type of an international agreement where they just lay out the framework, and then they have a party once a year in the Conference of the Parties. Everybody who signs on to the treaty goes and figures out how they're going to spend billions of dollars, to essentially run, I think, a corrupt business operation to prevent the next pandemic. Well, what ultimately happened was very, very complicated. There's a lot of space in between, the middle of 2021 and now the middle of 2025. Where we stand right now is on June 1st of 2024, all of the nations adopted through the World Health Assembly amendments to the International Health Regulations. That's an existing agreement that goes all the way back to 1969. Everybody raise your hand if you've read the International Health Regulations. Nobody has. Nobody has the foggiest idea of what's in there. Okay, so they made amendments to that existing document. It took them months to translate into the 6 languages that they are obligated to support. And it wasn't until September 19th of 2024 that they actually formally notified all of the countries that they had agreed to that back in June. So 10 months after September 19th is coming up very quickly. July 19th is the deadline, 10 months after the formal notification, that every nation on the planet still has the right to invoke Article 61 of the IHR and reject those amendments. Well, most people have no idea what those amendments are. They don't understand the process. Your nation does not need to ratify it.
No, that's
when
right.
they ratified the IHR way back when,
It's
the
if you
process
don't
for
knock it
amending
back, then it's automatically takes effect. And
if you don't speak up and say no, if you procrastinate, if you ignore it, if you just put it under a rug and don't talk about it for 10 months, too late.
yeah,
And by September 19th of 2025, a year after it was notified, it'll go into legally binding force. Now, that's something that we should talk about in much, much, much greater detail.
yeah. Sorry, what does it say? What's the
Well, but
meat of the
before I
amendment?
do that,
Yeah.
that is a totally self-contained, separate agreement, right? That's an existing international health regulation agreement all the way back to 1969. The amendments were adopted about almost 9 months now have passed since the formal notification. There's approximately a month left for nations to say, no thanks, okay? And you're not hearing about this in the media. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. It's been overshadowed by a totally separate batch of negotiations for something called the Pandemic Agreement. A lot of people know that as the Pandemic Treaty.
Yeah.
And almost everybody cross-pollinates the information and talks about both of these things and getting the information crossed between the two.
Okay.
The psychological operation that happened last month with the Pandemic Agreement was astonishing to watch. Okay. They've been negotiating for about 3 years. Now I'm talking about not the regulations, I'm talking about the Pandemic Agreement, totally separate document.
Yeah.
Back in April, the negotiators said, oh, we've reached an agreement on what they've been negotiating. And in the World Health Assembly, they went through a very contorted process, and they came out of the assembly stating that they had formally adopted the Pandemic Agreement. Well, one of the most important pieces of the puzzle that started these whole negotiations was actually put into an annex called the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System Annex.
Yeah.
And it says in the document that they agreed to that no nation can sign the agreement until they actually finish negotiating this Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing Annex.
Yeah.
So the psychological operation of having the theatrical production of, well, we agreed to the Pandemic Agreement.
We have an agreement, yeah.
But we can't sign it because we still are negotiating the part that we've been arguing about this whole time.
Yeah.
But they sugarcoated it to get the vast majority of the media to go, oh, Pandemic Treaty, over and done, give it up, go back to sleep. But on July 15th, they're going to have their first meeting of the working group to continue the negotiations. They think it's going to take a whole year. So we actually still now have a year to raise awareness of, well, wait a minute, what is it that you agreed to?
Well, more, because they've said it might take up to 3 years. So they've said the minimum is going to be 2026, but it's very open-ended. It's like they've got this date in there of 2026 in a year's time, but they've also given themselves basically an open-ended, it takes as long as it takes to write this part from what I see.
You know, lightning might strike and they might come to an agreement in 6 months and call a special session and ram it through. And so, you know, it's not the kind of thing that people should take it as, oh, we can all go back to sleep because it's going to take them another year or two or more. Now is the time for people to get informed, because from May 27th of last year until about the same time this year, they had never updated the document that they were presenting, what was in the Pandemic Agreement. So they have finally put their cards on the table. And now I encourage people to read the document and see what it is they're agreeing to. Now, I'm going to wrap all this up together in one neat package so that people can get the bigger picture, and then we'll go back and talk about the details.
Yeah.
They never once said a single word in any of the negotiations that I ever watched or documents that I ever read for 3 years questioning the things that you and I most likely and most of your audience have realized were bullshit, which is, the diagnostics were flawed. They, created a case-demic that was not necessarily real. The use of a ventilator and other devices or drugs like remdesivir or certainly the quote-unquote vaccines were of no benefit, and they actually caused more harm than good. That's not open to question.
No.
They didn't talk about that.
No,
they will not talk about that. They will not allow it to be questioned. That's misinformation. Well, I've learned that misinformation means missing information. They don't want you to talk about that. They decided back in June of last year that the only related, healthcare products that are relevant to a treatment for a pandemic are pharmaceutical products, the diagnostics, the devices, the drugs, and they very quietly added gene-altering and cell-based therapies. No herbs, no vitamins, no minerals, no homeopathic remedies, no natural anything. It's just all pharmaceutical.
The whole agreement is about the logistics, the manufacturing, the financing, the licensing. When they're talking about equitable sharing of information, you then read the detail and it's all about the licensing and the royalties and giving, fair terms, making sure that the licensing agreements are written within a reasonable time frame. The whole thing is a product sales pitch. It's a car financing agreement. It's got absolutely nothing to do with health, except for there's the nauseating wishy-washy crap that's all the way through it about equity and disadvantaged groups and irrelevances wrapped in ambiguities that are self-cancelling in many cases as well. It's utter crap, and then it's just product, licensing, financing, etc., etc. It's quite an extraordinary document to read because it doesn't pretend to have any. It doesn't, and all of the mistakes of the COVID experience, they're using to justify as why we need more power. It's absolutely astonishing. You go, they talk about the problems that can occur when there's a pandemic in terms of shutting down transportation and logistics and getting food to different... And you created all of these problems with your lockdowns and your border closures. Like, none of this was necessary. You did it. And now you're going, because we screwed the world, you need to give us more power to do even more. Oh, and sorry, the one other thing they've added in there is just like the PCR tests. This is just, it seems to me, utterly hysterical, looking for anything that might resemble a problem and having the most hysterical possible response that you could. Constant surveillance, always looking for a sick dog on the street anywhere and just lock down everything immediately because we need to test this and protect people and all the rest. It's batshit crazy, to be quite honest with you.
I think you've got the 2-minute clip that you need from our interview. You just put it out there. You said it fantastically well. I absolutely agree with you. And so the big picture is that what they learned back in the middle of 2021 was not what you and I learned and your audience. They learned that Big Pharma was not big enough. They learned that Big Pharma, working hand in hand with the government, is a very profitable business model. Mm-hmm. And they learned that they wanted to get, more in on the deal. Mm-hmm. And so I was blessed to watch a presentation back in, I believe it was October of 2022, where the Indonesian health minister, who's not a doctor, he's a former banker, okay, he was giving a presentation to the B20, not the G20, the nations, but the business leaders. Okay. And at the time, the United States was right on the cusp of dedicating billions of dollars through the National Defense Authorization Act of 2022, in December of 2022, $5 billion spread out over 5 years to go to the World Bank for the Pandemic Fund to start building out laboratory networks around the world to do exactly what you just said, looking for pathogens, under every rock.
Yeah.
And the Indonesian health minister said, there's billions of dollars being put into this. This is a great business opportunity. Go invest. Now, they're not investing in vitamins or minerals or herbs or homeopathic remedies. They're investing in all of the things that ultimately, I believe, have created a real pandemic of adverse events and death caused by, iatrogenic disease, which is doctor-caused ailments. And that's their business model. They convince people that they have a problem. They convince them that they have the solution, but the solution is a poison that maybe changes your symptoms, but gives you a whole different set of problems. And, they've concocted it in a way that people, unfortunately, many people, because sometimes it's delayed and it's so confusing, they don't connect getting injected with a vaccine, right? Or swallowing a poison on a daily basis to manage their cholesterol or blood pressure or sugar or whatever. They don't make the connection. Yeah. And it's always denied that the new problem that crops up shortly thereafter is actually due to the treatment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Once you see that and you recognize that that's the model, why in the world would you ever go back for more? But when insurance programs or national health services around the world only offer those things, and you have to pay out of pocket to get something that's actually better for you, the trap is even deeper, right? And so to talk a little bit about the international health regulations and the deadline that is fast approaching.
Yeah, right? you were starting to say that's a different thing. So
people have gotten all of these things confused. And so there are two separate documents and two separate processes by which those documents become reality and become legally binding upon the countries.
Yeah.
And so the trick that got played with the pandemic agreement, on one level, it's entertaining. They adopted an agreement, but it says in the agreement that you can't sign it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a little bit of a reprieve. I don't want to say put that on the back burner, but put that on the middle burner. It's off in the future a little bit. Start learning about it now. But we're hot and heavy with the deadline to reject the international health regulations because people have been asleep for 9 months. There's a 10-month period for every nation to reject them, and that's fast approaching on July 19th.
Yeah.
And so, why do we not want these international health regulations? Well, probably first and foremost is it defines relevant health products as only drugs.
Yes.
And so by allowing that to seep into an international agreement, you're basically saying all of the nations have to support Big Pharma. You can't do anything natural. We're only going to say that these are the things that can be done. And anybody who has become aware of the business model behind that should be arguing, vehemently, no, those are not relevant health products, especially gene-altering therapy. I don't think altering our genes to avoid a made-up, pandemic with, pathogen with pandemic potential, altering one's genes to prevent that type of thing is certainly not the proper path forward. It's not anything that any of us have had a chance to weigh in on, officially. So first and foremost, the definition of what they consider to be relevant health products is way off the charts wrong.
And I probably I'll just interject very quickly there too. People should be doubly worried that they're actually in the middle of human trials right now for the aerosolized vaccine, which when you really think about the rest of the terms in the agreement, they would see it as their right because it's written in there that they have the right to impose their will upon the population with or without the agreement of the government of the sovereign nation itself. But if you can aerosolize a vaccine, that means that if you go into a public building, you could get sprayed. You go into a lift, you could get sprayed. You go into the supermarket, you could get sprayed. Like it's crazy conspiracy theory talk at this point in time, but everything that was a crazy conspiracy theory 10 years ago has come true. So it's like they're testing aerosolized vaccines right now. And we already know that they want the passports to force vaccinate people and all the rest of it anyway. Why is it a step too far to think that they wouldn't do this? I mean,
exactly.
Nuremberg?
And
What's Nuremberg?
To add fact to what you just said about what's in the amendments, okay? They added the ability or the authority to quarantine people who are not ill.
Yeah.
Now, off the top of my head, I believe that was Article 27, where this is astonishing, okay? People don't understand how the terminology has been manipulated. The word quarantine, many people might believe, oh, if someone is sick, you want to isolate them. But they literally use the word isolation for someone who is sick. They added in the term quarantine, and the word quarantine allows them to essentially lock up someone who is literally, another term in the IHR, is a suspect. So if you're suspected of having been in, the general vicinity of someone who maybe was ill, you can be quarantined.
We saw this during COVID.
So this is added in, but it's also just adding to something that's already in the international health regulations, which is the moment you step outside of the border of the country that your home is, you're under the rules of the foreign nation that you may have traveled to. And let me tell you, all bets are off. Any rights that you thought you might have had in your country, as bad as they may be where you come from, when you step outside of the boundaries of your nation, you've got nothing. And so the doublespeak in the international health regulations, where the WHO says no nation should require that you have paperwork to document, that you've been vaccinated or whatever, unless your nation wants to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's when you read this, you start out going, oh, this sounds pretty good. And then you read the next paragraph and you're like, you've got to be kidding me. Well, this is how they do it. And what they've set up is a structure where each nation can write the most dystopian laws that they want to implement. Western Australia has some of the worst. Singapore has some of the worst.
Yeah.
On and on and on.
Yeah, Singapore
nation after nation, province and state. Right.
Scary stuff.
When the WHO makes a recommendation, it's not immediately an obligation for any nation to do that. They've covered themselves by saying, well, we just recommended it. What happens is locally, whether it's municipal, provincial, state, national laws, some of the most dystopian emergency provisions have been put in place that, give your own government the authority to do, pretty much what they did over the past 5 years. They didn't need a new pandemic agreement or treaty or amendments to enforce on a local level those dystopian measures. What they've done with the amendments to the international health regulation is they've added a new level of declaration of something called a pandemic emergency. Way back in 2005, they empowered the Director General of the WHO to declare a public health emergency of international concern.
Yeah.
PHEIC,
fake.
or fake.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the bigger fake is the Pharmaceutical Hospital Emergency Industrial Complex, also PHEIC. But they added not the definition of a pandemic, but a pandemic emergency. And I encourage people to go to rejecttheamendments.com, rejecttheamendments.com, and read the definition of a pandemic emergency.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty much just because the Director General says so.
Yeah.
There's no like numerical data or statistics or deaths or anything.
Well, they removed that in 2009, I think it was, when it was pointed out that it's like, hang on a second, because 2009 was the swine flu. And it was pointed out that it's like, hang on a second, your definition of pandemic includes lots of death. So they simply removed lots of death from the definition. So now it's just, if lots of people might get sick, might catch the thing,
exactly.
get diagnosed, then now that's it's another fake. And ever since they came up with that fake, there was a fake in 2009, 13, 14, 15, 18, 20, and 22. And the 22, the monkeypox one, was Tedros just going, I think this is a fake.
Right. Right. And so they've added what I call a super fake, this pandemic emergency.
Yeah.
And there's no democratic way to turn it off. It runs as long as the Director General says. So now, on one level, with an emergency, I can understand that in a true emergency, you give temporary power to an executive who takes action, brings resources, does whatever needs to be done. But there needs to be a check and a balance, whether it's a week or 30 days or 60, 90, whatever, where
you need to actively renew this if it's going to keep on going, and there needs to be
You've
a debate.
got to get the approval of the people to continue this. Okay.
Yeah.
So the way this is with the international health regulations, there are a number of things. People can go to rejecttheamendments.com and learn, what you haven't been told about what's in this document. Probably the worst of which, the most egregious, just fraudulent activity that should tell everyone what they need to know about who and what and how the WHO operates are, number one, they have a rule, Article 55, Paragraph 2, that says before any changes are made, they have to give 4 months advance notice. Well, the final version that got adopted, they're lucky that they had it the same day on June 1st. But even worse than that, there's an Article 44 BIS, that's just what they called it, 44 BIS, that sets up this coordinating financial mechanism. It's all of the money that they want to get to flow through the international health regulations to fund all of their operations. They didn't include it in any of the versions up until the very last version. And the manner in which they identified in the final version that they all voted on, this is the existing IHR. It's in regular typeface, and anything in bold were amendments.
Right.
Well, they put in this entire new article, 44 BIS, about all of the financing, and they also put in a paragraph in Article 54 BIS, the fourth paragraph. They didn't put it in bold print. They put it in regular font. So anyone who was looking through it, thinking about whether they wanted to vote on it, you wouldn't give it any attention. You're like, oh, that's already existing. It's not a change. I don't need to pay any attention.
Yeah, I'm not going to read a 70-year-old document again because I've read it before. Yeah.
So, they fraudulently adopted it without public comment, but also without properly actually identifying the changes that they were implementing. And so the big question that everybody should be asking is, well, wait a minute. How much is this going to cost? Who's in charge of determining that? And where is our government accounting office looking this over going, hey, wait a minute, we're not signing that contract. Would you sign a contract for somebody who said, hey, let's just put a couple of blank pieces of paper in here. We'll fill out that later.
Yeah, there's an open-ended financing clause in here. Yeah, it's
right.
You will drop a blank check on my desk in the morning and say see you later. Yeah.
And so the difficulty that we have right now around the world is to get people to understand that what is needed, the way they have this structured, it's simple to understand, but it's difficult to accomplish. The head of state of each nation, whether it's president, prime minister,
Yeah.
the Pope, okay, because the Vatican is part of this as well. They just have to write a letter to the WHO before July 19th and say, thank you, but no thank you. We're invoking Article 61. We reject these amendments.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a simple letter. It's easy to do. It's really hard to get your leader to do that. It's not about Parliament. It's not about Congress or Senate or your representatives. I mean, they might be able to, raise their voice about it, but it's not like they get to vote. This is handled by the head of state writing a letter saying, no, thank you. Now, I have hopes that there will be some heads of state who will do that, but Donald Trump has not done it. Okay? At this moment in time, no nation has written that letter. But the last time that this happened, back in 2022, there were some modest amendments that were adopted in 2022. 4 nations did reject them. Slovakia, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and the Islamic Republic of Iran wrote that letter before the deadline for the 2022 amendments.
Okay.
And so they have a longer period of time this time to write that rejection. This is something
the thing that they rejected was shortening that period of time to reject further amendments. Correct. Wow.
Right.
So they were setting it up.
They knew that they were going to be trying to push this through.
Yeah.
So, thank you for the opportunity to be sharing this information with your audience. As it stands right now, July 19th is the date that nations around the world, their leader, their head of state, has the authority to just write a letter to the WHO saying Article 61, we don't want these to apply to our country. You're off the hook for the financing. You're off the hook for listening when, he says there's a pandemic agreement. And essentially it would create the same thing that had happened with those 4 nations. You can have those rules if you want, but they don't apply to us.
Yeah, that's right. And just so that the listeners understand, in the actual original, I took the clause out of the original WHO treaty, which the 194 nations are signed on to. And in that you are agreeing to, quote, adopt conventions or agreements with respect to any matter within the competence of the organization, end quote, and the organization is the WHO itself. So unless, as you are saying, James, the country says, no, I'm not agreeing to that amendment, automatically you are agreeing to that amendment once that time period has passed.
Right. So they know that human beings are prone to procrastination. It's very easy to just not talk about it. And
there's an
the media doesn't want to talk about it. Government doesn't want to talk about it. And most of the media and the alternative media have dropped the ball on it. And so I appreciate, the opportunity.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, though, is that
there's
this assumption, and it's one of the main things I wanted to get at, is just the intention of this, because the assumption is that the WHO is second only to God in terms of godliness. It's beyond reproach. You don't question it. You don't leave it. Ultimately, you only need to read through I read the document myself, and it's just from the contents page, you're just going, hang on a sec, this isn't about health. This is about products, distribution. It's all, as you say, it's about drugs.
Surveillance and looking for pathogens that can be turned into money-making products.
Yeah, and even the actual process of, I was living in Dubai during COVID, where they were minting a new billionaire a week there, and it was people running the PCR tests. Short-lived billionaire lifestyle, but the amount of money being made off of the actual testing itself it's just astronomical.
It's unfathomable. It really is. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. So they want to build up all of this infrastructure to look for problems, and as we've already seen, they don't have any problem finding problems, because for the first 50 years of the WHO, there was no problems until they invented the fakes. And then all of a sudden, we've had one every couple of years since. And
you've got a clear understanding of the Hegelian dialectic. Create a problem, generate fear. They literally are terrorists.
Yeah.
They continually put out, disease X or whatever, they think that they can make people be afraid of. And the idea is, in advance of doing that, they want to find pathogens that have the potential to, cause such problems.
Correct.
Bring those into their laboratory network. The problem that they've had, now again, we're shifting gears a little bit because this is in the pandemic agreement that they failed to reach an agreement on, which they're going to be negotiating, is, well, if we find a pathogen in our nation, that's a natural, national, sovereign resource.
Yeah.
And so if nations want to give access to that pathogen, they want to share in the benefits. And so you're literally monetizing the search for the problem that they are claiming the Framework Convention to prevent pandemics. This is monetizing the search for the problem under the guise of trying to stop the problem. It's insane.
The next aspect, though, there were a bunch of phrases when people were first freaking out about the pandemic treaty, the zero draft when it first came out. People were talking about how they were saying that we need to take control of infodemics, and that was basically a pandemic of misinformation. I can't find that in the latest agreement.
It was enacted into an annex in the amendments.
This is what I was wondering.
Essentially, I think you've already said it. Most nations have taken the assumption. I think you said something to the effect of, the WHO is closer to God than anybody. Yeah. They are seen as the authority. And when you actually look at the information that they refuse to question, there has never been what most industries would call an after-event review, right? Hey, wait a minute. Were these PCR kits accurate? No. Did ventilators save lives? No. Was remdesivir beneficial? No.
Never.
Were the jabs doing anything other than having a negative effectiveness and making people more likely to become ill? Mm-hmm. They're not doing any of that. No. So everything that they are working towards is truly beyond misinformation. Mm. It's mal and disinformation. Mm-hmm. They are purposefully hiding the truth.
Yeah.
Okay. But they just keep lying. And some people are able to do that. Some people are not good at it and they can't get away with it. But they're very good at denying the reality that I'm pretty sure you and your listeners understand. But they've crafted legal, documents that they want nations to agree to. And a lot of it got transposed. A lot of it was in the amendments. And so you don't now see it in what is really a business deal in the pandemic agreement.
Yeah.
Luckily, greed on one side has been battling greed on the other side. Mm-hmm. So the nations that have great biodiversity and believe that they could find a lot of pathogens with pandemic potential are not in agreement with the nations who want to receive access to those pathogens in order to turn them into money-making products. And so those negotiations continue, giving us time to, raise the question about what in the world are you people doing with the pandemic agreement? But time is very much of the essence in rejecting the foundation underneath all of that, which are the amendments that were adopted to the international health regulations, back in June of 2024.
Yeah. But all of the underlying intention behind all of the sneakiness and secrecy all points in the same direction. It's the original hysterical view of the treaty, which is they basically want to cede sovereignty over the next made up.
It's not really sovereignty. We have lost our sovereignty in part to multinational corporations who don't care about national boundaries. Okay, even though the United States under Trump has told the WHO that we're leaving, and he pulled the negotiators away from the agreement, that doesn't stop all of the pharmaceutical companies and all of the relevant stakeholder non-government organizations based in the United States, they can absolutely participate in the pandemic agreement
anyway.
and this pathogen access and benefit sharing system.
Yeah.
So these corporations and international organizations, civil society organizations, they don't care whether or not the nations are participating. They want this to go through because they're going to participate regardless of what the nations do.
Yeah.
And this is the problem with the WHO and the UN. They are doing business with organizations and entities that are not nations.
Yeah.
They're going around the national structures. So we've actually lost our sovereignty, if you will, to these multinational corporations and organizations.
Yeah.
What we've also lost is our representation within nations, where the members of parliament or Congress or the Knesset in Israel or wherever, they don't listen to the people. They listen to the same multinational corporations and organizations. Yeah. They pass laws, emergency legislation, giving themselves authority to abuse our rights and freedoms. So we've lost our representation and the protection of our rights because our legislators don't listen to us. They listen to these multinational corporations. And the confusion has been that what the WHO understands is they don't need to put themselves in the position of having a bullseye on their back where they say, you must do what we tell you. It's structured in a way where they go, well, we're just making a recommendation. We got all these products that we've, put in our strategic stockpile. Would you like some poison?
Yeah.
And then your local government is the one who steps all over you, trying to get the products that only feed the beast of big pharma. And then, they want to say, oh, well, we're just doing what the WHO said is best. They're the authority. But they don't actually have lawful authority to mandate it. And typically, it's not mandated. It's coercion and psychological operations. If they can generate enough fear through government and media propaganda, and they get the vast majority of people to volunteer, well, who's to blame other than the people who allowed themselves to be tricked by this psychological operation?
Yeah, actually, when you say that, and I'm rereading in my head the document, and it struck me as extraordinarily fascistic in reading it. I mean, public-private partnership. What is that other than fascism? It's just, by definition. So. In
the 21st century, and this started about 20-25 years ago, I think fascism went beyond what Mussolini defined it as.
It's a different
animal,
and
it got a third leg that makes it really stable, which are all of these, not just corporations and government working together to abuse the people, but all of these pseudo, beneficial organizations, the nonprofits, the foundations,
the NGOs,
the non-government organizations. They present this, we're just here to help you.
Yeah.
So they get contracts from the government, funnel it through, various organizations, and all the profit seems to end up in the corporations doing their bidding, under the guise of, we don't want government to be doing these things because government legally maybe can't. But if they fund an independent organization to do their bidding, a Facebook or some other agency to censor free speech, or some other agency to take like USAID and take funding to go do social programs or whatever it may be, they enable government to offload the things that they're not really allowed to do. They fund it through corporations or organizations. And, I learned this very clearly. I was in a grocery store parking lot a couple of years ago,
right.
And there was this small Mini Cooper, all kinds of advertising for the polio vaccine.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, what in the, well, it was actually, had a little tiny logo on it. It was funded by Rotary International. The Rotary Club
The Rotary Club.
has donated hundreds of millions of dollars pushing vaccination. And so you go, how many people have donated to these organizations, whatever they may be, not understanding how that money gets laundered through all of these various, efforts to do things that, are just out of character. Well, if they're invested in this, that, or the other business venture, it all starts to make sense. They're all working hand in hand. It's a modern day fascism where corporations, these nonprofit entities, Bill and Melinda Gates and so forth, and, international pseudo-government organizations like the European Commission or the WHO or the United Nations, they're all working hand in hand with each other, not listening to us. And, that's because we've been silent. And we all need to speak up more. We need to get better informed. And, the deadline for the international health regulations to be rejected is fast upon us. So, now would be as good a time as any to speak up.
I wish I could be more optimistic about the government that we have in Australia at the moment to do that. But, they are hand in glove with this mob. There's
Absolutely.
no interest at all. And they all, they all fail upwards, don't they? So they like to keep their relationships good with the next level of political retards above them, so that they can then gravitate upwards to them when they've butchered the level that they're at right now. So
more and more people are becoming aware of what we are all talking about.
Yeah.
And so, even if it doesn't work in the next month to stop any specific nation from doing so, when people look at the documents and they go, wait a minute, Slovakia and the Netherlands and New Zealand and Iran rejected the amendments last time. Hey, it is possible. Why are our leaders ignoring us?
Yeah.
Now, it may take time for people to finally understand that it is possible and that some nations have done this. And I do hope and I have faith that some nations will do it with this round of amendments. It's all about raising everyone's awareness as to how this game is being played, and how they are preying upon our lack of information and our lack of awareness of what it is that they are really doing. And the more people who become aware and essentially say, you're not going to trick me with the next fear-mongering, made-up, ridiculous story. I trust that I have an immune system. I trust that there are natural means and that there are practitioners who care more about me than about turning a profit. Their system can be made to crumble, but it requires people becoming more educated, more active.
I think it's also interesting, just finishing off in terms of the intent, that in the terms once signed up to the agreement, you're not allowed to disembark or get out of it for 2 years. And if you do put in notice after 2 years after you've ratified the agreement, it's another year before you're actually out of it, and you agree in the agreement that you will be bound by it until that 3-year period is up, which is interesting in the context of generally a 4-year electoral cycle, which means that the bureaucrats can stonewall it for probably about a year, which then starts the 2 years, which then gets the year, which means the day that the last guy gets out of office, they've put their new guy in to sign up to the thing again. It's
and in this particular case, you're referring to the pandemic agreement, which at the moment nobody
isn't
can
signed.
sign.
I'm just saying it's
and so,
just every single thing you look at, you can just see the cynicism in it, where it's just this is.
You said cynicism, but I thought for sure you were going to say sinister nature. And I think they both apply. I think they both apply.
Same. James, thank you very much for going over that with everybody, and I'll direct them to your sites, and also hope that somebody important hears this message that, well, I think Trump's main answer is the only answer. It's just get the hell out of the WHO. It's just a bad organization doing real bad things. It's right there in black and white. It's not hard to read. People need to look at it because, like I said, you don't need to go much past the contents page to just go, this is just garbage.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for having me on. People can go to rejecttheamendments.com or rejectthetreaty.com. And I live in the United States, and I realize you're reaching an audience that might be around the world, but I always give everybody my phone number, so you can find me, you can text me, you can call me. In the U.S., it's 310-619-3055, 310-619-3055. And if you use Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp, you can probably find me there. I'm that serious about this. I get to meet people all around the world like I've gotten to meet you.
Yep.
And so thanks again for the opportunity.
No, thank you, James. Thank you very much for your time and the incredible research that you've done into this. So again, thank you. We'll speak to you soon.
Take care.